The year was 1943. A cold wind swept across New York Harbor as a small group of German prisoners stood on the dock, their boots scraping the concrete. The war they had once believed was Germany's to win now seemed very far away. Moments earlier, they had been marched off a U.S. Navy transport blindfolded for security reasons. When the guards removed the cloth from their eyes, a sight unfolded before them that none of them could have imagined: a vast ocean of steel, row after row of massive grey cargo ships stretched across the water, their hulls glinting under the morning sun. The sound of cranes clanging and welders sparking filled the air. Dozens of Liberty ships were being loaded, repaired, or newly launched, each one larger than anything the prisoners had seen at home. One of the Germans whispered to another almost in disbelief. "Even if Germany worked 100 years, we could never build this many." It was a moment of revelation and quiet defeat, because in that single glance, those men understood something. Their commanders in Berlin refused to admit the war was no longer about who fought harder. It was about who could build faster. And behind those endless rows of Liberty ships was an industrial force unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. But how did the United States, a country that had once struggled with the Great Depression, rise to produce ships by the thousands faster than Germany could sink them? The answer begins years earlier, before America had even entered the war. In the late months of 1940 and the early days of 1941, the world was already on fire. France had fallen, Britain was standing alone, and the Atlantic, the lifeline of democracy, was being torn apart by German U-boats. British merchant ships were going down faster than they could be built. Factories in Britain couldn't keep up. Food, fuel, and weapons were disappearing. Beneath the waves, Winston Churchill later said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Across the ocean, President Franklin Roosevelt saw what was coming. America wasn't officially at war yet, but he knew neutrality would not last. He called for what he named the arsenal of democracy. The plan was bold: to turn American industry into a weapon of war so massive that no dictatorship could outproduce it. But first, they needed ships, thousands of them. The U.S. Maritime Commission proposed a radical idea. Instead of crafting ships with care and precision, as Germany did, America would mass-produce them. Each one simple, rugged, and cheap enough to build in weeks rather than months. These new vessels would become known as Liberty ships, steel workhorses built to carry nearly 10,000 tons of cargo across oceans. Traditional shipbuilders scoffed. They said it couldn't be done. You couldn't build a ship the way you built a car. But one man disagreed. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship in his life. Kaiser believed in something the Germans never considered possible: that a nation's strength wasn't just in its army or navy, but in its workers. He gathered thousands of ordinary Americans, mechanics, welders, farmers, even teachers and housewives, and promised them they could build ships faster than anyone in history. And when the first Liberty ship slid down the ways in 1941, no one yet realized that this was the beginning of an industrial revolution that would shake the Axis powers to their core. But the real genius of the Liberty ship wasn't just in the workers. It was in the blueprint itself. The Liberty ship began as a compromise and became a revolution. In 1941, American engineers studied British cargo designs that were functional but outdated. They decided to strip everything unnecessary away. Every curve was flattened. Every complex joint was simplified. Rivets, the traditional shipbuilder's art, were replaced with welding, a method faster and cheaper, though new to shipyards. What emerged was not a thing of beauty. The Liberty ship was blunt, boxy, and slow. Sailors nicknamed it the ugly duckling. But what it lacked in grace, it made up for in purpose. It was strong enough to haul thousands of tons of cargo, and simple enough that almost any yard in America could build it. The plan was astonishing in its simplicity. Instead of relying on master craftsmen, shipyards would rely on mass production. Components would be built in sections prefabricated. Hull plates, deck houses, and engine rooms then welded together like giant puzzle pieces. This method meant that even companies that had never touched a ship could join the effort. automobile plants, bridge builders, locomotive factories, all retooled to produce parts for the Liberty fleet. Soon shipyards began springing up everywhere. Richmond and Sausalito in California, Portland, Maine, Baltimore, Savannah, and New Orleans. Dozens of new ports transformed into centers of endless labor. Night and day, the glow of welding torches lit the sky. Sparks rained down like fireworks as skeletons of ships rose from steel plates at unbelievable speed. A worker could look out over the yard one week and see nothing but scaffolding, and by the next a completed hull, towering above the waterline. Even the Germans' masters of engineering would have struggled to understand the sheer efficiency of it all. And yet, the most astonishing transformation was still to come, because in just a few short years, Henry Kaiser's dream of industrial miracle would push the limits of human production into the realm of the unbelievable. By 1943, the American shipyards had become something almost mythic, a realm where steel turned into ships at speeds that defied logic. The heart of that transformation beat inside Henry Kaiser's West Coast yards, sprawling, thunderous places where tens of thousands worked shoulder to shoulder around the clock. Kaiser believed the old ways of shipbuilding were obsolete. Instead of waiting months for a single vessel to emerge, he divided construction into hundreds of specialized tasks, each one small, precise, and fast. Every worker became part of an industrial symphony, each spark and hammer strike timed to perfection. And then, the world had heard of a record that seemed impossible. In November of 1942, the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary was laid down in Portland, Oregon. Workers labored non-stop shifts overlapping through day and night. When the ship finally touched water, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes after the first steel plate was set, the world could hardly believe it. German intelligence dismissed it as American propaganda, but it was real. The feat wasn't about one ship, it was proof that America had mastered something Germany could not: the art of speed. Ship sections were pre-built in enormous factories, welded and rolled by cranes into position like puzzle pieces. Women, Rosie the riveters, outnumbered men in some departments, wielding torches and tools that once belonged only to tradesmen. Teenagers earned their first paychecks, assembling ship parts that would soon cross the Atlantic. Each new record seemed to mock the Axis war effort. A single Liberty ship could be built in days, while a German U-boat might take months, and that changed everything. Because in the Battle of the Atlantic, the outcome wasn't just decided by torpedoes or tactics, it was decided by numbers. The Germans could sink one ship today, but tomorrow, America would launch 2 more. War has always been a contest of strategy, but by 1943, it had become something else entirely. It had become a contest of arithmetic. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled the seas like wolves. They sank Allied freighters by the hundreds, hoping to choke Britain into starvation. Convoys burned in the night. Sailors clung to wreckage in icy waters. But while the Kriegsmarine celebrated, each sinking something far larger was happening behind the scenes, an MSDAO, an avalanche of American production that no torpedo could stop. By the time Germany built one new U-boat, the United States had already launched dozens of Liberty ships. Every month, hundreds of new hulls rolled into the water, each one packed with food, munitions, and tanks bound for the front. Factories ran day and night under the roar of machines. The glow of steelworks lit the horizon like a second sunrise. Across the Atlantic, British intelligence marveled at the numbers, coming out of the U.S. Maritime Commission. And soon the German Navy began to notice something terrifying. No matter how many ships they destroyed, the ocean never seemed emptier. In fact, it seemed fuller. Captured U-boat officers later described their despair. We would sink a convoy, only to find another one waiting behind it and another after that. The Germans had built their strategy on fear to starve the Allies through terror and attrition, but the Americans countered with abundance. For every merchant ship lost 5 more would take its place. By 1944, the balance of the Atlantic had tipped forever. The U-boats were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Radar, sonar, and air patrols now stalked them relentlessly. But the real death blow to German morale didn't come from the ocean's depths. It came from what their captured sailors saw when they stepped onto American soil. They arrived quietly, under guard their uniforms, stripped of insignia, their eyes searching the unfamiliar American landscape. For many German prisoners of war captured at sea sailors from the Kriegsmarine or merchant convoys, the journey ended not in Europe but in America itself. When their ships were sunk or captured, they were brought across the Atlantic on Allied transports and offloaded at ports like New York, Norfolk, and Boston. It was there on the docks that they witnessed a scene none of them would ever forget. Everywhere they looked, Liberty ships, dozens, hundreds, each one the size of a fortress lined up in perfect rows. Cranes swung massive containers into their open hatches, and sparks rained down from welders repairing fresh launches. Trucks rumbled by hauling parts, fuel, and food. Behind them stretched rail lines loaded with jeeps, tanks, and crates marked Saver Lines. Lend-Lease, USSR. To men who had grown up in the bombed-out factories of Bremen or Kiel, it felt like another world, a world where nothing ran out. A young German lieutenant captured in 1943 later told, "Interrogators. In Germany we had precision, in America they had infinity." In POW camps across the United States, that realization spread like wildfire. Many of the prisoners were not fanatics. They were sailors, engineers, or mechanics, men who understood what industrial power really meant. Some worked in agricultural programs or factory details, where they saw firsthand how casually Americans produced things Germany could barely afford. One prisoner later wrote, "We had thought ourselves the most advanced nation on earth. But here, even the tools, more modern than our dreams." For these men, the endless Liberty ships weren't just cargo vessels, they were monuments, proof that Germany's vision of conquest was built on sand. But the power of those ships wasn't just in how many there were, it was in what they carried across the world. Every Liberty ship carried more than steel, and supplies, it carried hope. From the frozen ports of Murmansk to the burning sands of North Africa, these grey-hulled vessels became lifelines for millions, each one loaded with grain, gasoline tanks, trucks, and the machinery of survival. They sailed in great convoys, hundreds at a time, cutting through Atlantic waters that once belonged to the U-boats destroyers guarded. Their flanks aircraft circled overhead, and sonar pulses echoed through the dark. The ocean had turned from a graveyard into a highway of deliverance. In Britain, entire cities depended on what the Liberty ships brought: bread for families, fuel for Spitfires, and medical supplies for the wounded in. The Soviet Union Lend-Lease cargo from Liberty ships kept Red Army tanks rolling toward Berlin. One American freighter could carry enough steel to arm a division and enough food to feed 10,000 soldiers for months. By 1944, Liberty ships were no longer slow, vulnerable freighters. They had become the arteries of Allied victory. Even when some were sunk, more followed immediately behind, so many that Allied commanders joked they could walk to Europe. On Liberty decks, behind each ship, stood thousands of American workers, welders, engineers, dockhands, mothers and sons, all pouring their labor into a single mission: to overwhelm tyranny with production. When the German prisoners saw those convoys depart, they understood that these were not just ships. They were a message that the United States could lose battles, but never momentum. By the end of the war, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been completed, more steel than Germany could have produced in an entire generation of peace. But the final blow wasn't in tonnage or cargo manifests. It was in realization, the moment when even the enemy knew they were witnessing something unstoppable. For many German prisoners, that moment came not with a gunshot or a surrender, but with silence. They stood on American soil, far from the thunder of the front lines, and watched Liberty ships glide across the horizon one after another, like an endless procession of floating factories. And in that quiet, they understood something their own leaders never would. Germany could fight battles, America could replace them. Interrogation records from the US War Department reveal candid admissions from captured sailors and officers alike. One U-boat officer confessed, "When we saw those docks, we stopped believing in victory. You cannot win against a country that builds like that." Another POW, an engineer from Hamburg, described it even more vividly. We used to think the English were stubborn, but the Americans they build as if time itself obeys them. The sheer scale of industry left them speechless. They had believed Germany was the pinnacle of engineering, precise, efficient, methodical. Yet here they stood surrounded by a nation that produced so much so fast that mistakes didn't matter. American workers could weld in the rain, work through the night and still launch a ship before the week's end. Every clang of a hammer on steel seemed to echo the same message. Germany cannot outlast this. Even years after the war, during interviews in Allied custody and in post-war memoirs, former German officers returned to that memory. Not the bombing raids or the front lines, but the sight of Liberty ships, stretching to the horizon. To them, it was more than industry. It was inevitability. One POW put it best. We realized in that moment that we had already lost not on the battlefield, but at the dock. And long after the fighting stopped, many of those same men would help rebuild a new Germany, one that learned from the very system it once underestimated. But back in 1943, that realization was still raw, and the sound of shipyard hammers still rang in their ears. The Liberty ship was more than a vessel. It was a declaration, a statement forged in steel, that no tyranny could outbuild freedom. By the end of the war, America had not only armed itself, but the entire free world. The Germans had precision, discipline, and some of the most advanced technology of the age. But the Americans had something far greater: scale imagination and a belief that problems were meant to be solved, not feared. Each Liberty ship carried more than cargo. It carried the idea that democracy itself could become a weapon. In every bolt, every weld, and every riveted seam was proof that a free people, when united, could create a machine of victory greater than any empire. The German POWs who stood on those docks in 1943 didn't just see ships. They saw a future they could never have built under a system of fear. A future made of freedom, production, and relentless possibility. For them, the war ended not with the blast of an artillery shell, but with the quiet rhythm of hammers striking steel echoing across the American coast. That sound, metallic, tireless, unstoppable, was the sound of a new world being born.